Hello there. This video, I want to share with you the kind of software design you'll be exploring here in this course. The blue pill, the more usual way to design software is that you design it for multiple people. It's often a perception that the user is the problem, as we'll see in a bit, and also a perception that a better interface, a better app will solve everything. Let's look at what the red pill here might be. In this course, we are not going to be building software for many people, not even for two people. We're going to be building software for one person, specifically Soloware, and you'll notice how big of a difference that is in terms of the design and the kinds of things that you look for and optimize for. One thing you'll learn in this course more generally is that generalization and automation are the same move. And you want to rage against scaling and generalizing your software, because what you're doing is not caring about the specificity of the person and their experience and their rituals. And for a long while that was okay because we couldn't do anything better, but because of advances in coding, we have a lot more leverage to be specific, to finally work with the value there. And that's what we want to be doing in this course and in the Slowathon more generally. Let's take an example. I developed this Soloware recently called Social Latency, which was basically about problem responding to messages like WhatsApp, email, etc. The idea was to help the person reduce the gap between message to response. You can see that they had a really big problem with this. And this is not a software that you typically build to scale. This is a very specific problem, and the workflows around this and the data requirements and privacy stuff is quite hard to scale. For example, here are a bunch of things that were different from normal software here. There were no accounts or authentication because it was only for one person. No one else is even supposed to look at it, let alone use it. There is no settings or preferences screen because all of the settings are hardcoded into the app. Whatever the user wants and needs is literally built into the software, period. Something else was that this Soloware didn't even need real code robustness. For example, one reason for robustness is that a bunch of different kinds of users will use your software in a bunch of ways that are unexpected and that are surprising to you, right? And your software should accommodate and be prepared for that. That problem doesn't really exist in Soloware because you're working with one person and you're in direct conversation with them. And you know what they work like, you know what their experiences, you know what their workflows are, so you can really design for them and not really for all the other possible workflows that don't exist anymore because there's just one person. Another interesting thing is that with software, one general way to know if your software is a success is how long are people using it. What's the duration? What's the engagement like? Which is kind of not true for Soloware because you can be more specific. For example, for a bunch of Soloware, the tool isn't meant to be engaging. It's not meant to last them for years. And it can, for example, with the social latency software, it is supposed to go out of their life naturally. It is supposed to be the scaffolding that helps them with this problem, and then over time, when that problem stops becoming a problem, the tool retires. And one pretty good heuristic for Soloware, which is also somewhat different than software, is that simple is good and complex is bad. And there are some obvious reasons for this, because of complex software having more bugs, more moving parts, it's harder to maintain. But also because complex software is usually software that you want to be scaling, software that you want a bunch of people to be using, software that is robust, software that has a bunch of different functions. And when you're building software, you want to question those instincts. Are they necessary? Or have you lost the plot? For example, one challenge I want to give you is in whatever sessions that you do with people, and whatever problems you identify, some codependency or independent risks with their software and their technology more broadly, and solutions that you think of What if the solutions are not software? What if they are not interfaces even? What if they're scripts? Or what if they are more simpler things? I'll remind you of this again, but it is quite useful to question the most basics of assumptions of what software should be and what technology should be when you're going really, really specific with the person and with their needs and with their experience. One way to describe this retiring of the software that is quite unnatural is that the complexity of the software depends on the relationship of the person to their experience and should evolve with the latter. And one way to think of complexity here is how many balls is it carrying for the person? How much is it helping them? How big of a scaffolding is it? Here is a common um, model used in education, for example, the expertise reversal effect, which describes how a novice fails really badly when it doesn't have guidance, which makes sense, and increases their performance when their guidance is increased, which makes sense. But the weird thing is that the opposite thing happens for experts, where they perform worse with guidance than without. And this is illustrated well by this example where if you give a recipe to someone who's really bad at cooking, they would really appreciate it and their cooking would be better because of it. But if a trained master chef tried to follow a recipe, that would probably worsen their experience and worsen their performance. And so, an interesting way to think of software in this soloware framing is to think of software as scaffolding that can loosen up over time, that can evolve over time, that is really meant for the structure and is not the center in itself. The other two ideas that I want to explore, aside from the raging against generalization and raging against building for multiple people, is these two ideas which are, well, the first one is that the person is not the problem, the interface is. And the second one is the interface is not the problem, the person is. Let's get to the first one first. So this claim that the person is the problem, the interface is a pretty standard claim in design. You'll learn it in Design 101. And feel free to pause this video to read this quote from Don Norman's book, which I recommend regardless of this course. There is a common frame where addiction, lack of an understanding of how apps work and what to do with them, and even more broadly, just around interfaces that are beyond software in general, there is a common tendency to blame people for it. That if someone doesn't know how to order food, it is their fault and they're dumb. Or if someone is addicted to their phone, it is because they have a lack of self-control. Yada, yada, yada. And in these moments, as a designer, it's useful to remind oneself of this beautiful claim that Scott Alexander makes. And to realize that if you're blaming the person as a designer, you've lost the plot of what technology is for, of what your role is, of who you're building for, what you're building for. And on the opposite end, this quote is a very interesting, somewhat intense quote that you might even enjoy feeling into and communicating with your client in this way. Feel free to pause the video to read this one. And when I say that the person isn't the problem, the interface is, the latter part there matters because interfaces are influential. And here is a few types of how interfaces influence people's behavior very directly and clearly. With dark patterns used in design, often in social media, advertisement, and a bunch of other very scaled up and very big apps and websites. Different launches that people use that help them change their behaviors with their phones, and different kinds of hardware even, so you can go beyond software. Let's go to the final idea in this video. The interface is not the problem, the person is. So to balance the previous idea about interfaces having influence, It is also the fact that you can take that to the extreme and forget that the person also has influence and make the interface parasitic. For example, the person can become dependent on the interface, and there's this relationship going on where the interface has an influence, but so does the person, and you cannot build an interface to save them from themselves. No interface will do it, and you shouldn't try to build one. For example, writing a system that does the creative work for them is not a good interface because it shouldn't make the person go dead, go passive, extract the meaningful stuff from them and automate it away. A good interface is one that invites aliveness and meaningfulness, that makes the person participate and participate in ways that feel relevant, that feel that they're rich and full of meaning. It does not make the person sit back and dissociate and let the computer do everything. A related thing here is that interface design should not pull people into their screens. It should not make them codependent on the interface and the screens, and it should be scaffolding, be a facilitator for their actual life. Well, screens are a part of it, but they're a lot more bigger than that. And here you can explore, for example, with interventions that are around hardware, around awareness practices, around a lot more stuff that is just useful. And feel free to employ it here. Even though we are intervening with technology and interfaces and coding in this course, let's not become codependent on it ourselves as designers, and let's not assume that our solution is the solution that will fix everything. Let's keep that relationship healthy, balanced, light. And let's not do all the frame management for the client.